So I think we can probably get started. For those in the group who I haven't met yet, my name is Sarah Sweat. I work for Oregon Sea Grant, based out of Oregon State University, and I am their Marine Renewable Energy and Communities Extension Specialist. And these programs, these Lunch and Learn presentations, are intended to support the Oregon Offshore Wind Energy Roadmap, and they're a way to bring in outside information and expertise into the process and give participants an extra resource to learn about these, different important components of offshore wind planning and development. So today we're going to have some quick updates from California. I know a lot of people have been very curious throughout the process, and with everything that's going on, just changes at the federal level where California is and how things are going with their different state offshore wind processes. So today we're joined by Abby Mohan, who's the Senior Offshore Wind Program Manager at the California Ocean Protection Council, Heather McNair, who's a environmental scientist at the California Coastal Commission, and Tanner Etherton, who's an economic analyst and offshore wind extension specialist with California Sea Grant at the Schatz Energy Research Center, based out of Cal Poly Humboldt. I hope you guys all remember all of those credentials. There'll be a little quiz. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so we're going to just hear quick updates from each of them. I don't think any of them have any slides to share today. So the intent of this is to ask questions and just have a good conversation so we can kind of understand where California is at, and then hopefully take some of their lessons learned, their considerations, and roll that into our Oregon roadmap. So Abby is going to kick us off with her quick presentation, and then we'll hear from Heather, and then a quick update from Tanner. And then the rest of the time we have today until 1 o'clock, we can take questions and hopefully have a good discussion. Jeff, not sure if there's anything you wanted to add. Otherwise, we will.
No, only that, I'm excited. I get to talk with these folks every now and again, but it's good to have everyone together to give us the big picture. And I think, is Holly going to join us as well, maybe in a little bit?
Yes, yes. So Holly Wire also from the California Coastal Commission, who works with Heather, is joining as well for the discussion.
Well, take it away.
Okay.
All right. So, my name is Abby Mohan. I'm from the Ocean Protection Council. And for those of you not familiar, the Ocean Protection Council is kind of an interesting state agency. Our core mission is to really advance innovative science-based policy and management, and help make a lot of strategic investments. And really what Ocean Protection Council does and is really good at is creating policy and action with partnerships. And so, as Jeff said, we have Heather from the Coastal Commission here, who I have the pleasure of working with all of the time. But one of the things, for example, that OPC leads in the offshore wind space is an environmental working group across state agencies. So pulling together a lot of all of the different agencies, from those with the permitting and regulatory overview, like the State Lands Commission and the California Coastal Commission, with those very deeply involved in the planning processes, such as the Energy Commission, and then also pulling in all of the other environmental impacted, or the agencies that do a lot of the environmental work with considerations around offshore wind, like the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Water Board, and a few others. So OPC really is that sort of catalyst role of bringing together a lot of these people, to make sure that there's good communication across agencies about the various work streams focused on the environmental space. And then also really working on making some strategic investments so we can make sure that when we go to have conversations and do permitting and regulatory processes and create policy around some of that management of offshore wind, that it's really informed by science and that decision makers have what they need to make really good, robust decisions. Just to be clear, Ocean Protection Council is not a regulatory agency, so we are not involved in any of the permitting or overview process for that. I think Sarah also mentioned a question about California with the relation to the federal situation and considerations. And as of right now, California is still moving ahead with offshore wind and offshore wind planning. Our leases are still active, and California is currently a little bit more deep in the process of port planning and in that sort of getting readiness phase of offshore wind development. A lot of that work is being led by the California Energy Commission. So to talk about what I am really focused on doing, and there's three kind of big buckets of work that Ocean Protection Council is currently leading right now to help inform a lot of the offshore wind, looking at environmental impacts and really understanding the ways to really manage offshore wind in a productive way. And the first thing is OPC has partnered with the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation in order to develop offshore wind environmental monitoring guidance. This is really to identify the most relevant environmental impact questions, suggest and evaluate some monitoring methods and approaches to address these potential impacts from floating offshore wind, and then to really, from a science perspective, raise considerations in regard to specific taxa or habitats or monitoring technology. This work has been ongoing for the past couple of years and is set to wrap up next summer in May or June of 2026. And it has involved over 200 scientists, including scientists from Oregon. In fact, we have a couple of people from Oregon that are chairs of some of our working groups. And it's involved working groups on fish and invertebrates, birds and bats, marine mammals and sea turtles, and habitats and ecosystems. So this guidance is really going to provide a lot of science foundation for looking at, what kind of monitoring best practices should the state adopt and what sort of technologies could be really useful in monitoring impacts for offshore wind. The second thing that OPC has invested in a project that I am very excited about is we have partnered with the Ocean Science Trust and the Environmental Law Institute, which is an East Coast national organization, and the UC Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. And this is really looking at that legal and that regulatory perspective and doing a stoplight analysis of state and federal authorities that are relevant to potential environmental impacts and trying to understand about adaptive management and would these authorities have potential capacity within them in order to adaptively manage offshore wind projects. They're going to do an overview analysis of all of the authorities relevant to environmental impacts, but then those opportunities that they identify that are really the top adaptive management opportunities, they're going to go on a little bit more deeper dive and an in-depth legal analysis of the potentials for that. And then they're also going to be doing some case studies, looking at some of those relevant lessons learned for effective management, adaptive management policy. And that is expected to come out pretty quickly in January 2026. So that way we're bringing together some of those scientific foundations and then also trying to bring that regulatory analysis and perspective in. But the biggest project that I'm really working on is developing a West Coast science collaborative for offshore wind. The East Coast has several organizations, the RWSC, the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, and ROSA, the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance. And Rosa on the East Coast really focuses on fishery and fishery impacts, and RWSC on the East Coast really focuses on those environmental components, those environmental impacts. And so OPC has some seed funding and is working on launching a West Coast Science Collaborative that's actually trying to pull both the work of Rosa and RWSC on the East Coast into one organization here on the West Coast. And also to really elevate tribal knowledge and really bring a lot of tribal perspectives into the work that has traditionally been dominated by a lot of Western academic science. And the goals of the WCSC, the West Coast Science Collaborative, are really to provide scientific expertise and traditional knowledge, to synthesize some of that monitoring and research data and information, and establish those standards. What are the best practices? What are some of the guidelines for monitoring for impacts for offshore wind? You know, there's been a lot of guidance developed on the East Coast, both by BOEM and the Northeast Fisheries Science Center and a few others, but most of that guidance that exists is really focused on fixed bottom offshore wind platforms and is really particular to the Atlantic outer continental shelf. Well, here on the West Coast, here in the Pacific Outer Continental Shelf, the conditions are a lot different. We're also going to be using a different technology like floating offshore wind. We have upwelling and a variety of other species. So while some of that guidance is going to be really applicable to offshore wind development here on the West Coast, not all of it will directly translate. And so the West Coast Science Collaborative is going to help sort of tackle bridging all that information that already exists on the East Coast and bring it over here to the West Coast. And also really looking at identifying and prioritizing coordinated research and monitoring. You can't you can't require coordination across leaseholders for monitoring programs. They are often at different time scales and have different economic considerations. But when you can get coordinated monitoring, which was seen in an example of Power On from the East Coast, which did passive acoustic monitoring. You can really leverage a lot of resources. You can have more data transparency, and it's like it can be a better regional way of looking at some of the impacts and gaining some understanding there. And so we want to, you know, you can't do coordinated monitoring for everything, but like what are the monitoring approaches that would or really lend themselves well to that coordinated monitoring program? And then how would you go about creating and launching that sort of coordinated monitoring program? So the West Coast Science Collaborative is going to bring together federal agencies, state agencies, California state agencies, tribal governments, and offshore wind leaseholders. And then we're also going to be pulling in some representatives from Oregon, Washington, the fishing community, and NGOs in order to, in an advisory capacity, to the sort of steering committee, which is the overseeing body of the West Coast Science Collaborative. But the real heart of the work for the Science Collaborative is going to be subcommittees. And for example, like I talked about the ROSA, which really focuses on fishery impacts, there's going to be a fishery impacts subcommittee that is where a lot of the work that is done by ROSA on the East Coast will be led and centered around here on the West Coast. The WCSE is intended to be pretty California focused to begin with, but you know, recognizing the California current ecosystem is a large and interconnected ecosystem that doesn't pay attention to political boundaries. We intend on pulling in scientists from across Oregon, and also if there are future offshore wind lease areas off of the coast of Oregon or Washington, then we'll expand to ensure that it really is a full West Coast Science Collaborative. And that's why we're bringing in all of the states in the beginning as part of that advisory capacity. And that we're really hoping to launch in spring of next year. There will be a release of a blueprint, sort of a charter, an interim charter and bylaws, and that goes into a little bit more details about the structure and the near-term activities, released at our December council meeting. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. There was a question in the chat, which I think you answered, which was who is on the West Coast Science Alliance, and then is there a regional component to that, as was done on the East Coast?
So just to be clear on language, there is a West Coast Ocean Alliance, and we are the West Coast Science Collaborative, which are like different organizations. So I would just want to make that distinguished for language. And then the question of how science finds its way into decision making, and this is exactly it. Where the OPC, that's what OPC really does, is we help make sure we're funding appropriate science and that we're providing forums and opportunities for science in order to integrate and work directly with regulators and industry, as policy and permitting advances.
Got it. Thank you. And then there's one more question in the chat that, Abby, if you want to take a look at, we could save that for the discussion.
I can answer real quick about approaching tribal engagement and studies and stuff. And we've done some consultation and roundtables with in-person sort of roundtables with tribes in the offshore wind lease areas. And we're planning on actually having a tribal co-chair for most of our environmental subcommittees. And we're also going to be opening that invitation to participate, not just a federal and state government, but also tribal government leadership as well on the steering committee.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, we can move on to Heather now. Yeah, and please feel free to use the chat for questions. We can take clarifying questions or save them for discussion if they're a little bit more robust. All right, Heather. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, Sarah. And yeah, I'm joined here with Holly Wire, who's the senior supervisor of our offshore wind team at the Coastal Commission. And so as you have questions for us, both Holly and I can try and address those. And it's nice to see some familiar faces, names on the call. I think I was here in May is what my notes say. And we were talking about community benefit agreements. So since then, we've continued our work with the 7C working group, as the shorthand has become, but the fisheries offshore wind working group. We are looking at the end of our process here. We have our last full working group meeting in November. After that, we should have all of the pieces of the statewide strategy for the coexistence of offshore wind and fisheries in California. We'll have all of those pieces done, and through our working group process, then our staff will knit those all together into the document that becomes what we've termed the statewide strategy. So we're trying to wrap that up kind of the end of the year. Early in January, we will go back to the working group and say, here's the full thing. Does this, we had to make editorial changes or things like that. Does this represent what we've worked on? After that, we will make any edits that need to be done. And then the plan is to release it early next year for to the public. And so with that, we are looking to also have an informational hearing at one of our commission meetings. So the target is for February, where we'll spend a significant amount of that February commission hearing talking about updates just generally about offshore wind, where we are, what the work has been done going into offshore wind, what staff is still working on, and then really looking to introduce this statewide strategy, talk about the context in which it was made in, why we feel like this is the right framework to move forward, start getting public comment and public feedback there, take that back and make any revisions as needed, and bring it back to our commission in April for a a decision on adopting it as the statewide strategy. And so I think since I was last here, that timeline is kind of solidified in that we're looking to finish up the end of the year, have something public early next year, and get a decision from our commission in April. I think similarly to last time I was here, the big pieces we're still working on are a socioeconomic methodology to assess the impacts from offshore wind that on fishing communities, and really looking at those impacts that couldn't otherwise be avoided, minimized, mitigated. So what that remaining kind of economic impact is on fisheries. And then a framework for compensatory mitigation. So in those impacts that need mitigation, what's the best way to get that to fishermen and or to fishing communities to make sure fishermen can keep fishing, that fishing communities can stay resilient. And so we've kind of built out this framework of a program that includes payments directly to fishermen that are significantly displaced from the area or significantly impacted economically, and then this resiliency funds for community level impacts. So that fishermen will have control over where those funds get spent in the view of making a resilient fishing community. So those are the big pieces we're working on. I guess sorry, the other big piece we have coming through this last meeting is a tribal fisheries chapter. So that there are tribal fishermen that participate in commercial and for-hire fisheries, and so that's addressed in other chapters of the statewide strategy, but there are tribal fisheries practices that do not fall under that. And so we had this chapter for unique tribal considerations and how to think about impacts to tribal fisheries specifically. And that has, we have a NOAA Sea Grant fellow who's really taken the lead on that and has done an excellent job. We've done a lot of the tribal consultation with OPC, did a North Coast and a Central Coast tribal consultation together to try and get some early feedback on that. So that's where where the fisheries working group has landed. And that's kind of our biggest, at the Coastal Commission, that's our biggest effort right now. We do have port planners that are working both in Humboldt and at Long Beach with the plans to build heavy lift terminals there. Those are pretty slow right now, not a lot coming through yet. But yeah, happy to answer other questions and talk as helpful.
Great. Let's see, there's one question in the chat. How do you ensure that mitigation funds going to commercial fisheries benefit downstream folks like crew members and not just the boat permit owners?
Yeah, that is a great question and a hot topic. So the way we are looking at it in the statewide strategy is saying that you should consider this as you're looking at how to build out this direct payment program. And there's actually, just out of Virginia, just released a draft of their direct compensation program that I think is the first one that includes specific compensation for captain and crew. And so as far as we're covering it in the statewide strategy, you should think about ways to make sure captain and crew are compensated, and also relying on there's going to be some time between now and then where we can learn from all these other compensation programs that get built up about how to effectively do that.
Thank you. I definitely have a couple questions for you that I can save for the discussion. And we'll let Tanner go and give his quick update too, and then we'll move to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And yeah, I'll keep it quick. It's less of an update as much as it is just kind of letting you know who I am and why I'm here. And thank you, Sarah and Jeff, for having me. And good to see you, Abby. Abby actually sits on our advisory board for Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium. And Heather, I haven't met, and we didn't get a chance to say hi before we started, but really happy to be here. So my name's Tanner Etherton. I'm an economic analyst at the Schatz Energy Research Center, and then an offshore wind extension specialist for California Sea Grant. And while I kind of wear two hats, it's really one role, and that is to connect the science with the communities on the North Coast, so they better understand some of the socio-economic implications and general impacts of offshore wind to these communities and tribes and environments, and have the tools and knowledge available to them to be able to advocate for their own needs and benefits. I think what's most relevant to this discussion is the work that I am doing currently with the aquaculture community in Humboldt Bay, and impacts around the port development and concerns there. So while Abby and Heather talked a lot about, to some degree, the offshore impacts. Here in Humboldt as a host community, oftentimes we're looking at those nearshore impacts and concerns for our communities, tribes, and industries. And for aquaculture, we are a key bay for the industry on the West Coast, providing a large portion of the seeds that go to bays in Oregon, Washington, California, and even down to Mexico. And we have the ability to export because we have a clean bay status. And there's concern that we could lose that with industrialization, from things like offshore wind. And of course, there's dredging and other impacts of industrialization that are of concern. And these same concerns exist for our tribes and our fishermen who I work with as well. That yeah, I don't think I need to go into too much detail. One project I am working on currently and somewhat similar is an economic impact analysis for aquaculture, just getting kind of a baseline data on the industry currently prior to development, and something for those businesses to be able to use in their conversations with the community and with the harbor district as these sorts of projects move forward. I think with that, I can let it go. Also have, we work a lot in the transmission area. There's offshore wind, there's the ports, and there's transmissions, the way we like to look at it. And relevant to port as well, we did release a port permitting document through the Shots Energy Research Center, which I'll throw in the chat of a colleague of mine that I feel like is particularly relevant to this conversation. It is California specific, but useful information about how that permitting process looks like and the roles of the Coastal Commission, as well as other state agencies. Thank you all.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, and I'll make sure that all of the things that are put in the chat are included with the recording for those who aren't able to attend. Well, I think we have definitely a wealth of knowledge here about some of these things going on in California. And we've got about a half an hour to ask questions and discuss some of these things in more depth. Jeff, do you have any questions that you want to get us started with? Because I've got a few that I could do, but I'll let you ask.
Oh, that's so nice. Let me see. Let me look at my list that I was developing.
Yeah. And then everyone feel free to use the chat to write in.
Yeah, I guess taking aim at ourselves a little bit, we're at the stage where we're still making a roadmap for offshore wind, and you all have one. And I'm curious, in the work that you are doing, what has been the value you've found from having that California roadmap? How much is it actually informing the work that you're doing? Are there things that it didn't anticipate or that you wish it had dug deeper into? Just kind of getting to that value. And I guess a follow-on would be like, boy, is there a policy you really wish you had right now that would make you feel a lot better? And as we're looking at our potential policy gaps, we're just, how can we make the most value of the time that we're in?
I can give two concrete, I can give two concrete examples if you like. In the AB 525, in that permitting roadmap, it really laid out all the different permits that would need to be done. And we were able, as part of the Marine Sanctuary Foundation Environmental Monitoring Guidance, pull out the subset that really looked at the environmental impact and the environmental permitting process, and do a little bit of a deeper dive and reach out to the various regulatory authorities and agencies and gather, like, well, what is the data that you use to fulfill that permit? What other agencies do you consult with when you're doing this permit? Like, what is the information that you need to have in order to sort of, execute this regulatory authority? And pulling that together is very, very helpful, because it helps ground a lot of the science with, like, well, what is the data and information that is already being collected as part of this sort of regulatory process? And it really helps identify areas where, in consultation and collaboration, where earlier conversations could be very helpful. And then that also is the list that was kind of the foundational list that we're using for the adaptive management work that we're doing right now as well. Really doing that deep dive and saying, like, okay, now that we understand the various permitting, like, what are some of where in these authorities could there be capacity for adaptive management? Yeah.
I think so. If taking it more to the specific example of this statewide strategy for fisheries, and thinking of, if you think of that as a roadmap too, what like in the last year, 6, 7 months, I feel like a lot of our discussions have very much been focused on process rather than finding the answer right now when you don't have projects in front of us, when we don't know what the timing is, but really building out, what does it mean to have full fishermen engagement in understanding what the impacts are from these projects? What does it mean to use the socioeconomic methodology? So, and I guess I've gained a lot of appreciation of the power of just writing down a roadmap for what the process will look like to find those answers that you don't know now, that you can't do without specifics in front of you. So yeah, I think roadmaps that can paint the picture of, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, but here's how we figure it out,
Yeah.
is super helpful.
Why don't you
Yeah,
jump in?
I would second what Heather said, and I was just thinking in terms of the roadmap you're developing versus the AB 525 roadmap, which is the one that California developed. I think the requirements for both those roadmaps were pretty different in some ways. Like, I think there are some things that you're doing that might be a little bit more like the fishery strategy, in the sense that you may be laying out a little bit more process. Um, and I feel like having the AB 525 strategic plan was just, they were given such a broad charge of things to work on. And I think having a slightly narrower charge has made, I mean, this fishery strategy is challenging as it is, but it's made figuring out some of that process a little bit easier because the scope was narrower. Um, so yeah, finding those key processes and really building them out is incredibly valuable.
Thanks.
I'm wondering if you guys, Heather and Holly, can speak a little bit to how the California Fishermen's Resiliency Association was formed and how that coordination is going. Because I think that that's one of the things that Jeff has been thinking about, is like, what is the best mechanism, kind of like how you guys are saying, it's really about figuring out the process, like what is the best mechanism to get fishermen engaged and consistently and continuously engaged.
Yeah, and actually this is also a relevant question for Abby, because OPC actually provided funding to CFRA. So we talk about resiliency funds through the statewide strategy, and that's a separate thing. There's this group of fishermen called the California Fishermen's Resiliency Association. Did I get that right? Okay. That is self-formed, as far as I know, that has tried to bring together a bunch of different association gear types, geographic range, to find that organized voice of providing input not just for offshore wind, but for coastal projects across California. So yeah, I guess slightly separately, differently, the working group that's working on the state rights strategy also tried to get at different gear types, different geographies, folks that could be affected by offshore wind, but that was a selection process. So we asked the Coastal Commission asked for nominations, and then Coastal Commission staff selected the members there. So that was just a little different, like we asked for nominations and then stood up the working group. Rather, CFRA is a self-organized alliance of sorts. And Holly or Abby, if you have any more insights on the formation.
One thing I can add to that is like part of what we, looked at funding when helping to support the, formation of the CFRA. It's not intended to be continuous, ongoing, but it was intended to be a mechanism to sort of allow, build capacity for fishermen to self-organize, and also help with like some of the 7C participation in that. But one of the other things that we built into our grant agreement with them was building in some capacity for the fishermen to develop white papers and research of their own. So it wasn't always everything was coming at them to look at, but also, what are some of the questions and what are some of those research needs and reports that they're looking for and asking for.
Yeah, I can't speak as much to the specific formation of CFRA, but I could say that like their executive director, Ken Bates, comes from a background of organizations in California that have been created around fisheries and gear types that needed to interact with cables or like fiber optic cable companies, and those cables were having impacts on fisheries. And so these cable committees were formed that involved like the cable company and some of the impacted gear types and fishermen in the area. And those cable committees essentially managed funds that were provided for impacts to that fishery. So those cable committees have been regional, and some of them have worked much better than others. And I think part of the formation of CFRA was to create an organization that would not only do all the things that Heather and Abby have described, but also could ensure that like if something similar happened in the future, those funds would be managed in a way that was really effective and had good governance. And it's also bringing together fishermen from this wider array of fisheries, because frankly, offshore wind is so much bigger than one cable coming into one port. So you really can't get away with just having like a few people from one fishery on a cable committee anymore.
Yeah. Thank you guys. There was a question in the chat. How is California addressing the issue of scenic resource impacts from offshore wind? Is it a wait and see approach, like waiting for a visual impact assessment, or is it more proactive, like establishing goals for limiting impacts and providing mitigation?
I can speak to this a little bit more narrowly in the context of tribal cultural resources and the visual impacts therein. There are some other visual impact assessments and things that are led by BOEM. So, actually, a lot of the visual impact purview and the regulatory purview of that really does more fall on BOEM. And a few of the other federal permitting agencies. But one proactive thing that OPC is working on through the development of the West Coast Science Collaborative is building a tribal cultural resources subcommittee to be a tribally led space. But in order to be proactive and sort of identify, what is the kind of considerations and questions when we finally have a COP, when we finally know where things are going to be, or those sort of cable landing and that kind of things, not just visual impact, but some of the other considerations. Forming that group early to think through a lot of these considerations. So then that way, by the time we get to having COPs and we start to know a lot more of like where these things will be, there's already been a discussion on how to approach.
I would just add that during our review of the lease sale under federal consistency, BOEM provided a visual simulation of what a potential wind farm in those lease areas could look like. And so that was really helpful for our review and to show the public what these could look like. Also included an analysis of the kind of, I guess, the sort of typical weather conditions in the area, so which does affect like how far out you can see into the ocean. So included, yeah, daytime, nighttime. So I will say like our process is inherently reactive. We have to get a project proposal to respond to it, but having that visual assessment at the leasing phase was really a valuable thing to be able to show, hey, worst case scenario, here's what this looks like from several different viewpoints.
If I can jump in to ask a clarifying question, when you get to the review stage, is there a policy that you would look toward to say we have a policy that dictates when a visual impact is acceptable versus not acceptable?
The short answer is yes, we do have visual resources policies in Chapter 3 of the Coastal Act, which is our part of our enforceable policies under the California Coastal Management Program. So we would be looking at that as part of our assessment. And I can't quote them to you off the top of my head. I know some of them are a little more focused on getting view. At the time the Coastal Act was written, there was concerns about being able to see the ocean from the land side because there were concerns about private development building big mansions or something. And even though you're right next to this ocean, you can't see it. So there was some concern around that. So some of it's a little more focused that way, but there's still aspects of the policies that are applicable to this.
Jumping in on that, I did throw in the chat those visual simulations. Don't go check it out now, but for future reference, it's definitely worth looking at. And then additionally, when we talk about visual impacts, obviously, again, offshore, but also near shore at these staging integration ports is really important to consider, and similar resources in those areas. Such as in Humboldt Bay, we have Tuluwat Island, which is the center of the universe to Wiyot people, and it's directly across from the staging and integration port where we'll be building these massive, 900, potentially 900 plus size turbines. And so the Harbor District did something really cool and did visual simulations in Bay, which we found really informative for the community. It is a long video because they go through an effort to explain what goes into these visual simulations. So you better understand what you're looking at. So I'm not going to give you the timestamp, but if you scroll through, you can find it that way. But yeah, just thought I'd throw those resources out there and note those nearshore visual impacts as well.
Thank you, guys. Another question in the chat for Tanner or Abby. What type of baseline studies have been or will be done before the installation of floating offshore wind turbines?
I can talk real quickly about 2 recent grants that we received through Coast CSU. Cal Poly Humboldt received to do some surveying in the Bay. And this grant opportunity was specific for offshore wind. And so one is a pinniped survey around harbor seals and sea lions in the Bay. And then we're also doing an eDNA survey from Humboldt Bay out to the wind energy area. And we are partnering on that project. So those are 2 examples. And then additionally, I did mention the economic survey I'm doing with aquaculture, but there's a clear need, or according to our community, a large voice asking for more baseline data, both nearshore and offshore. And hopefully Abby could talk a little bit about what OPC is thinking with the monitoring guidance.
Has funded a few smaller projects over the past few years. Like one example is doing a comprehensive mapping of eelgrass in Humboldt Bay in order to provide some of that baseline information. And there's a lot of baseline information that has to be collected by the developers as part of their COP development. And so part of what I was talking about earlier with like, really looking at the permitting and the data and the collection and information is identifying, well, what will be collected or, by developers as part of that process. And then the environmental monitoring guidance is really looking at like, well, what are some of those gaps? Like what are the environmental impact questions? What existing monitoring programs exist that could answer that? And then what are some of the questions that we know we're unable to answer because we will be unable to detect an impact because we don't have a baseline to reference to. And so, it's anticipated that OPC will be doing some funding over the next couple of years for some of these baseline considerations, but it shouldn't all be on the state, and there's no way that there's enough funding and capacity, particularly given a lot of the other funding limitations that are happening outside of the world of offshore wind off the California coast right now. So yeah, we're trying to do the best we can, but working really closely and coordinating with a lot of the scientific community to, really tie together the existing monitoring programs and then some of those gaps in baseline information.
Yeah, thank you. Abby, I'm wondering if you could clarify a little bit more about where the West Coast Science Collaborative is in its formation and next steps.
Yeah, so we're going to be releasing a blueprint at our December 9th council meeting as an informational item. After that, we're going to be doing some public engagement for, it's the holidays, so January and February. And then, OPC has some seed funding in order to initiate the launch and creation of this. And so we're expecting to launch in early 2026, I would say March, April, forming a steering committee. But then there's like going to be, many other phases to, initiating some of the near term work plans and development of subcommittees and developing some scope and agenda for various, of the sort of work streams. So a lot of that work will be getting started next year, but a lot of it's not expected to be completed. This isn't a short-term work. This is a lot of just as Heather talked about the process and how 7C is really helping identify the process and laying a lot of the foundation, the WCSC work that gets started next year is expected to take sort of a few years. In the long term, it's not intended to be solely in California, and it's also not intended to be solely hosted by OPC. We're just intending on incubating it for the first few years, and part of that near-term work will be that long-term viability planning and determining like where it should live and the final sort of organizational structure and a lot of those details. The geographic scope, though, is Oregon, Washington, Oregon, California, and the California Current Large Marine Ecosystem.
Just want to say I appreciated that answer, Abby, because it answers some of my questions about when might we learn, if Oregon wants to participate, what is the need from Oregon in order to support the ongoing continuation of this group? What is your plan for kind of that longevity of the group after the seed money? But it sounds like that's going to be kind of task one.
Yeah, and like a perfect example, and like part of why we are bringing in, and the other regional Washington and Oregon, as sort of those advisory capacity to our steering committee, is to when we start to initiate that long-term viability and that long-term planning, that's when we'll, make you're already sitting, you'll already be in the conversation in the presence, and so that's when it can start to be a conversation regionally across states about some of that long-term considerations. I think where Oregon and Washington are right now, it doesn't make sense to try to ask you to help, do fund and start something up, but it will be imperative that we have that perspective when we start to get to that long-term viability planning.
Yeah. For what it's worth, in our working group talking about research collaboration, one idea that bubbled up to the top was even just to create a little purse here in Oregon that people could be putting money into, to where if we opportunistically see, you're all doing a study, if we could just expand it a little bit into Oregon, we could learn something we need to know that we can capitalize on those efficiencies and opportunities.
why all of the subcommittees will have a very broad invitation for membership to sort of join and participate, and that's exactly why we are bringing Oregon and Washington in that sort of early part of the conversation, so we can identify those synergies where they are.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I think we have time for one more question. And if no one else has a question, I have one, more for Heather and Holly. I attended a Sea Grant workshop on the East Coast last week where we heard from East Coast fishermen and their perspective on, monetary compensation was that should be like the last resort, and that that is not what the fisheries necessarily want, and that they should, the industry and the state should really be doing everything they can to try to find other solutions and not just default to that compensation. And I'm wondering if that kind of echoes what you've heard, and if so, what some of those methods for, avoiding that as, or, keeping that as the last case scenario might be. And I know that we'll keep up with the process and we'll see the findings soon, but if there was anything on that topic that you thought would be helpful to share, that would be great.
Yeah, and thanks, Ed. That's a great question. So we certainly, in like the way the strategies like projected out and knitted together, is really following that mitigation hierarchy of like you need to avoid all the impacts that you can. You can minimize them, you should, and if you can't, that's when you get to mitigation. So there is a big effort in the strategy to say the best way is to avoid the impacts, right? That's the best way to keep fishermen fishing. That's the best way to have this coexistence. And then we have a chapter on what mitigation or minimization measures might be helpful, avoidance and minimization measures might be helpful, to get to that same point, to really minimize that impact as much as you can first. And then in the end, for those impacts that can't be mitigated, which this is taking up fishing grounds, so there's an assumption that there will be some of those impacts that can't be avoided and minimized. What does mitigation look like? So, right, very much a last in the line of how you try to address the impacts, but a pretty important part too. And I think even in that mitigation discussion, there's been a huge emphasis on trying to find ways for compensation that keep fishermen fishing and is not a payout to stop fishing. So to keep those vibrant fishing communities, to keep folks around. And yeah, Holly.
I would just second that with one thing we've heard over and over again from the fishermen in our group is they want to keep fishing and they want solutions that keep them fishing. They're not interested in just getting a payout. And that actually isn't as consistent with our policies. Our policies are to ensure the continuance of fishing activities. And so, that lines up well with this idea of like, we got to keep fishermen fishing. And so I think we're pretty consistent with the East Coast states in that way and what you're hearing from fishermen over there.
Thank you. All right, well, if no one has any extra follow-up questions or final thoughts, we can, oh, Jeff.
I want to reflect on how glad I am that our roadmap got an extension, because it sounds like a lot of the things you all are working on are going to slot right into some topics that we've been discussing. We've been talking about adaptive management and accountability in particular. And so hopefully the legal analysis you all are doing is going to shine a light there. We've been talking about community agreements and benefit and how we engage with fishing communities in particular. So hopefully the work you're doing there is going to be helpful. We're talking about research and science and how do we reach a consensus and who needs to and what do we need and when do we get the baseline info. And so it's heartening that we're going to have something to look at as we're nearing finalization of our roadmap to see if there are any great ideas that we can pluck and incorporate.
I think maybe too, Sarah, on that last point, and I know that it came up in Oregon, and was brought into some of the California discussion. There's been this real like acknowledgement, maybe not realization, acknowledgement that one of the best ways to avoid impacts is through really good siting of lease areas. And so as much as that gets pulled in, just avoiding those conflicts to begin with is really helpful.
Yeah.
You all did a sea space suitability study that was led by the state, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I think in future, if future leasing happens, I think there's a lot of appetite for an NCOS model, um, that takes on what Oregon did, maybe tries to expand it further, that really, goes beyond just where BOEM identified. But yeah, I think there's a big appetite for using modeling to try and get to that.
Yeah.
If I would just like to extend an invitation for that environmental interagency group I do when you want to have Oregon come present to us at one of our Friday meetings, and sort of pick our, the interagency collaborative of brains as you're nearing the finalization of your roadmap, please reach out.
Careful what you wish for. I'm going to come on with lots of questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Holly, Abby, Heather, and Tanner for giving us an hour of your time. This recording will be uploaded to our YouTube, so we'll make sure everyone who could not attend has it. And yeah, thank you again. This was a great conversation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for making the time.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day.